It's also really an honor to be here with Alan and Pamela. Both of them are great leaders, and great leaders in the deepest sense, which is they both created platforms that allows thousands of other people to take leadership roles. Through City Year and through Universal Giving, many other people can discover hidden resources of strength and agency that they never knew that they possess. That's really what the deepest form of social change is releasing the potential that other people don't even know that they have within themselves.
Imagine what our country would be if we all felt like we held an office. And we swore that oath to the Constitution and to that mission of America to form that more perfect union. What would our country be like? And if obviously, hopefully people would be involved in service, but also involved in politics. It's part of the reason I finally, I decided to jump into that Senate race a year ago, and involved in movements for change. And to try and stir that notion of, it is big citizenship, it's people getting involved.
As a social entrepreneur, to really become an effective social entrepreneur, one of you said that it's almost like you have to do it. There's just a drive to do it. And I would say it is not a choice. I mean, when I was starting Universal Giving, I had billboards up in my room that I put, "You will not give up." And I was shaking in my boots, but I did not have a choice. I did not feel I had a choice to start Universal Giving. No matter how much fear, no matter how much concern I had, it was so clear to me from my life experiences and my personal stories that this is where I needed to go.
Well, welcome everyone. It's really great to have you all here with us tonight for a program that's really expanding our understanding of the world as well as our understanding of Mary Baker Eddy. Although that's the subject that we deal with on a daily basis, what's great about these programs for us who work here at the Mary Baker Eddy is that they encourage us to view the subject matter that we have here through a different prism, through a new prism. And I know many of you received little cards when you came in to perhaps note comments about the program. But one thing I would ask you to think about in the context of this program is whether or not Mary Baker Eddy qualifies as a social entrepreneur. And I'm going to make the case very briefly. It's just going to be very brief. And I know many of you don't really have that much background on Mary Baker Eddy, so you may want to defer weighing in on that question. But my understanding from having read materials by all three of our panelists is that in social entrepreneurship, it is the social good, which is the yield that one looks for, that's the primary profit that one cares about. But that one wants to use the techniques and the aptitudes and the strategies of business and technology and other facets of life to really maximize that social good and that social yield. And with Mary Baker Eddy, I think that one sees those two elements coming together. She had a transformational experience in midlife, and out of that transformational experience, she developed a conviction that healing was a right for everyone in the world, and that it was available through the insights and perspectives and the spiritual laws that she was discovering. And she made it her business after that to share that insight in as effective a way as she could in the world. She did it as a writer. Leslie referred to her book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. Now, she didn't have any background. She wasn't from a well-placed family. Her education was minimal. And yet, she effectively published this book and distributed it in a way that has now reached millions of readers throughout the world. She developed real savvy in the area of publishing. And in fact, the building which we're sitting right now was originally built as the Christian Science Publishing Society. It was built after her death, but in tribute to her. And in this building have been published many of the periodicals newspapers, news sources that she founded and started. Some with a religious focus, others with an inspired focus, but not necessarily a religious one. Probably most importantly and famously, the Christian Science Monitor newspaper, which she started at the age of 87 in 1908. And it bore the mission, as it still does today, to injure no man, but to bless all mankind. And it was a radically new model for journalism in many ways. She birthed this newspaper at a time when yellow journalism, sort of scandal sheets, were the stock and trade of the journalism industry. And she set up a model where journalism was about being very real, very gritty, looking the stories of life straight in the eye, but always with that understanding that she had gotten out of this transformational experience that there is healing potential in any situation. And it informs how the Christian Science Monitor covers the news. So that's my argument, that Mary Baker Eddy perhaps qualifies as a social entrepreneur. But as we learn more about this subject from our panelists, I encourage you to think about whether or not she would fit into that category today. So let me introduce to you my co-panelists. Furthest to my right is David Bornstein. David is a journalist, and he is really one of the, I think, if not the leading expert, certainly has to be one of the leading experts on the subject of social entrepreneurship. He has written extensively on the subject. One of his first notable books was The Price of a Dream, the story of the Grameen Bank, which many of you may know of, which was started by Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh, using the approach of microfinance to sort of transform lives in that area of the world. He's also co-authored with Susan Davis, Social Entrepreneurship, What Everyone Needs to Know, and he's the author of How to Change the World, Social Entrepreneurs and the Power of New Ideas. And this book has been translated into 20 languages and has been described in the New York Times as a Bible in the field. And we do have copies of his book available after the program in the lobby. David has his own website, dowser.org, is that correct? Regularly publishes on that website. And he has a regular online opinion column in the New York Times, which appears on Tuesdays, and it's called Fixes. Yes, it focuses on solutions. And next to David is Alan Casey. And Alan Casey certainly must qualify as one of the leading social entrepreneurs in the United States and in the world. He may be best known to you as a political candidate or as the founder of City Year. But he's a favorite son here in Massachusetts, so we're so glad to have you. He's on the road quite a bit because he's just published a book called Big Citizenship. What's the subtitle again? How pragmatic idealism can bring out the best in America. You know, I've been saying that title all the last month, but the critical moment. But you know, just out of college, it really, and correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, but this conviction about the importance of citizen service really came about while you were in college. And shortly after college, he founded City Year, and it's an extraordinary story about how this sort of youth service organization got started and how two idealistic young men, he and Michael Brown, got it going. Really, it was just an idea, and but it really goes to show, like with Mary Baker Eddy, that if you have a powerful idea, it will find its way, and it certainly found its way with the shepherding of Alan and Michael Brown. You know, recently he was very much with us during his candidacy to fill the Senate seat of Ted Kennedy, and I think and a lot of people appreciated so much how somebody with his kind of background really changed the political discussion about how we could all really be part of politics, part of government, part of leading society in new directions. So I just want to thank you, Alan, for that.
Thank you.
For that message that you brought in your candidacy. Recently, he started Be the Change, which is a nonprofit that really brings together all those different strata of society to change the landscape of our world. Nonprofits, government, individual citizens, really just everyone. So it's a very exciting project. And his book, Big Citizenship, is also available in the lobby after the program. And then right next to me is Pamela Hawley, and she's also a leader in the social entrepreneurial revolution. She's the founder and CEO of Universal Giving. And this is an internet platform which provides direction and opportunity for people to give and volunteer with top-performing social projects throughout the world. Essentially, what Universal Giving does is to vet and explore all these different initiatives in the world and to match people who want to get involved with that project, which would be best for them, most suited for their objectives and ideals and interests. She's a guest lecturer at the School of Business at the University of Southern California and teaches and speaks in a variety of venues throughout the country. So welcome, and enough of me, and now to the real stuff. So David, if you could get us going with just giving us a perspective on what this all means in our world today, social entrepreneurship.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's really an honor to be here. As a journalist who really focuses and believes that the role of journalism is both to inform us about problems, but also to help us understand how to construct a better world. You need to do both those things for social change really to happen. It's really an honor to be here because this is really, I guess, the home of solution journalism. I mean, for more than 100 years, the Christian Science Monitor has been doing something that very few publications have done globally, which is to lead by showing really how society can, as you said, heal itself, and not just letting us know what our deficiencies and shortcomings are. It's a very, very key role, and I was kind of amazed to discover that Mary Baker Eddy founded it when she was 87, because if she had passed away at 86, the field of journalism would be very different. It's also really an honor here to be here with Alan and Pamela. Both of them are great leaders, and great leaders in the deepest sense, which is they both created platforms that allows thousands of other people to take leadership roles. Through City Year and through Universal Giving, many other people can discover hidden resources of strength and agency that they never knew that they possess. And that's really ultimately the deepest form of social change, is releasing the potential that other people don't even know that they have within themselves. So it's wonderful opportunity for me. I mean, the field of social entrepreneurship is sort of a new field. Like any new field, it has borrowed its language from an existing field until it invents its own language. So we use the word entrepreneur because most people seem to know what that word means. And it's when I talk about social entrepreneurship, many people have different sort of definitions of it, but it's people creating structures that advance social change with an element of dynamism in it. It doesn't have to be a business. It can be a nonprofit. It can be a hybrid. You find a lot of people who are sort of working in this gray area between business and the nonprofit world. It can also be working through governmental agencies as what we call intrapreneurship, where you come into an existing agency, a hospital, a government agency, a school, and you transform the way that agency works from within. We have, the United States is a very institution-rich society, and we don't always have to create a whole bunch of new institutions. We have a lot of old institutions that really need to be revamped from within. So, and a lot of companies too. So when you think of social entrepreneurship, think of also how can you change the company in which you work or the agency in which you work. So it's a very broad idea. And what I want to mention are just sort of 3 points. Is like, why is this new, or is this new? Why should it be relevant to everybody in this room? And ultimately, what's the story that I think as a journalist is not yet being told, or is not being told very well? So the first thing is, why has the field of social entrepreneurship come along now at this sort of point in history? And it's clear to me well, I would say, it's always clear to people who think it's their idea, but it seems clear to me that there are these really powerful historical driving forces that have made it possible for much larger number of people around the world and in the United States to essentially shape their own lives, but also their societies, to actually make a change. And so what are some of the things that have made it possible just in the past, say, 30 or 40 years? Well, one of them would clearly be the women's revolution. The fact that half of the people in the world, in most countries, not in all countries, have much greater degrees of freedom and much greater options and a different sense of perhaps what their role should be. Many of the social entrepreneurs I've interviewed in Brazil and India, if I went back 20 years, they wouldn't have envisioned that role for themselves. They would have envisioned a much more traditional role. So the women's revolution is a huge change. The education revolution is an enormous change. In the 1970s, the number of universities in the world doubled just in that decade alone. And it's accelerated in many, many parts of the world so that you have millions, hundreds of millions of people now who have the opportunity not only to go to secondary school, but to go all the way through college. And you have far more, the growth of the middle class in developing countries has spread. Money, of course, moves across borders and is much more fluid than it used to be. And of course, global media, where you have ideas. It used to be that in order to prevent ideas from entering the Soviet Union, you actually had to stop cassettes from getting into the country, because that's the way ideas were traveling. It's pretty hard to do that now. So you have all of these things. And at the same time, there's this ability for people to be powerful because of access to education, also because of longer lifespans, all sorts of things. You also have this perception globally that the existing institutions really are not solving the most crucial problems of our time in history. So governments have not really addressed global warming, for example, or the fact that there are still, 1 billion people who go hungry. In the age of the iPad, we have people still going hungry. It just doesn't make sense to thinking people. And so this sense that the institutions that we've created and we've lived with for decades just have not solved the problems. And our businesses have ignored many problems. We just have not structured businesses that can do things like bring food into the inner cities at an affordable price. So we have food deserts all across the United States where low-income people literally don't have a vegetable within 3 miles. Really crazy problems that the institutions haven't solved. So the brain is a survival mechanism. It evolved basically to solve our survival problems. And so a lot of people look at these problems and they say, hey, we have to invent new institutions. And they also have this power to organize themselves using technology, and they're able to get access to information. So you sort of have these sort of two curves. The supply of people who can be change makers has increased, and the demand for their services has increased. And that's why I think you see this sort of global explosion today of what you can think of as freelance change makers. Or Nicholas Kristof wrote an article in the New York Times Magazine 2 weeks ago, I believe, where he called it do-it-yourself foreign aid, where he profiled 4 young women who had sort of gone out and created their own institutions to solve problems that they saw. So do-it-yourself, Home Depot, World, whatever you want to call it, a lot of people are saying, hey, this is something I can do. It's something that actually allows me to align my talents, my interests, and genuinely have an impact in the world. So it's quite fulfilling, and the world really needs this to happen. So there's many reinforcing factors. The reason why I think this is really relevant for just about anybody, because whether you're a student or a policymaker or a business person or a doctor or a lawyer, the way that problems are being solved today in the world it is changing dramatically. The way we're organizing the solutions is changing dramatically, and in some ways the expectations for what it takes to be a really powerful person in the world is shifting, in the sense that where the solutions are, we can no longer sort of look to academia or the government and say the solutions are there. The solutions are maybe scattered in 100 different places. So for individuals who want to be actively engaged in the life of their society, understanding how the field of social entrepreneurship is producing a lot of these new institutions and new career paths and opportunities is really the place where you can really tap into the core vitality of the world today. So I would argue that it's probably the most exciting place to look for what is going to happen over the next 10 years that really is going to shift things. And many of the ideas, even if you look at sort of Obama's healthcare legislation, a lot of the focus has been on access to care. But some of the most creative things in that are the new institutions, the new ideas that are being funded, the new models and so forth. And a lot of that is being started by social entrepreneurs. Finally, as a journalist, I often sort of compare journalism today as it's practiced to bad parenting. I have a 7-year-old son, which is to say that if he woke up every morning and at the breakfast table I reminded him of all his shortcomings, all the mistakes he made yesterday, so that he would become a better person, I would be a really bad parent. He would end up probably, in an institution. Well, what are we doing here? We're basically saying that the way to change society is to point out its shortcomings and to criticize it and to expose the wrongs and to expose the scandals and the corruption and all that, which is pretty much the bread and butter of journalism as it's practiced. It doesn't have to be that way. What we know from behavior change, from the field of behavioral psychology, and from many concrete examples on the ground, whether it's getting people to take care of their diabetes, to quit smoking, to save more for the future, almost all behavior change is aspirational. It usually requires that people see a path in front of them that makes sense to them, that's attractive, and that is doable. So when you think about how do you actually change society, if we have all of these problems with our education system, with our judicial system, with our political system, with corruption in politics or access, the effect of money in politics, we can't just write about them every day and say, we have this problem, we have this problem, we have this problem. We need to let people know what the potential, if not proven, at least the potential pathways are to solve these problems. And we need to do it just as much. It's said that the reason why King Solomon was so wise was because he had memorized 3,000 parables or aphorisms. And he had all this wisdom that he had sort of accumulated, and then in a given moment he could deploy it. He could figure out which wisdom was necessary to call upon. Doctors or a good clergyman will have seen many social problems over the course of his life, human problems, and then when you come to him for guidance, he says, "Oh, I've seen this pattern before. I've seen people who have suffered this way before. I think I can draw upon their experience." In the same way, I think it's up to journalists to help people understand the patterns in society, the potential new institutions and new models that are emerging that could help address the problems that they report on every single day. And so that if you have this balance of both being aware and well apprised of the serious problems and also having a sense of the different pathways that are available for solving those problems, it could create a lot of excitement rather than what we see, which is a lot of apathy, a lot of people turning away from the public space, turning away from the commons and focusing on the backyard, which is the area where they can exert control. My home, my kids, my private school, and not the public domain, which is where we really need to invest our efforts. This is what Alan writes about, so eloquently in Big Citizenship. The citizen, taking the role as really helping to correct the society. I think I know in my experience as a writer, as a journalist interviewing people, there's a tremendous untapped yearning among people to be able to play an active role in fixing the world. And what is often missing is that people don't see that they can make a difference. They don't believe that it's possible because they don't have enough examples in their head of people who have actually solved problems. If they heard, they all know 100 business entrepreneurs who have started Apple Computer and Microsoft. Everyone can name a dozen entrepreneurs who started with $10 and now are worth $100 million. But very few people can name 10 social entrepreneurs who started with $10 and created an organization that's helping hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of people, or a few hundred people, or maybe just, a community, whatever. Very few people have those examples loaded up in their brains. to let them know that the pathway is available to them, that it's an exciting and fulfilling one. So that's kind of I think the big, the hidden landscape that is now, that we live amidst. And I think part of the big, one of the things that I would like to help contribute to is making some of that more visible for people so that they can figure out how to navigate it for themselves. So thank you.
Well, thank you, David. Yeah, Alan, if you could sort of bridge with that and talk about how you've experienced bringing about this kind of change that David was referring to.
Sure, Jonathan, thank you, and thank you for the very kind introduction. And as David said, it's a real privilege and honor for me to be on this stage with David and with Pamela, two outstanding leaders. And I think what you just, all the writing that David's done and what you just said is so refreshing. If we could just have like 10 more journalists like David, I think, we'd really change the world, even just 10. I'd love to have 1,000, but, and I just say amen to everything you said. I'm going to talk a little bit about, try to build off of that, and just, as Jonathan said, I just did write this book, and I'm going to try and give you a little sense of why I wrote it, and what I've learned as a social entrepreneur and somebody who's been in the service movement. The first thing you notice about my book is that it's bright orange. Now you see these beautiful city-year young people here, they're wearing red jackets. The book was supposed to be red. It really was, and the galleys were red, the drafts was red, and to sort of line up with City Year. And then I got a call one day from my publisher, from my editor, saying, "Well, we gave your book to the art department, and they have a different idea." And I said, "Well, what is it?" "Well," he said, "we'll send it to you, and we think you'll like it." And one thing you learn if you ever write a book is you can control what's inside. Your publisher controls the outside. So I got this in the mail, and I opened it up very anxiously, and I've got a bright orange book. And I showed it to my wife, and she's very kind, and she said, "Oh, orange is a nice color." But I realized there are some really good uses for a bright orange book. If you get an extra copy and you keep it in your car, and you break down at night, you don't need a flare. Or if you have young kids like I do, I have an 8-year-old and a 2-year-old, and you keep it in their room, they're never scared of the dark. But the truth is, I'm still sort of getting my head around that I've written a book, that I'm an author. I think of myself more as an activist and a doer. And my publisher was right. Whenever I walk into a bookstore, you can't miss it. So it does stand out. So they had a good idea there. I wrote the book, and I want to echo a lot of what David said about the power of the social entrepreneurship movement. I wrote the book firstly out of a sense of gratitude. Because what I've found that beyond meeting my extraordinary wife, Vanessa Kirsch, who's also a social entrepreneur, and the birth of my kids, there's been nothing more rewarding, more valuable, more empowering in my life than having a dream to try to make a difference, and then working with other people to see that, who you share values and ideals with, to see that dream happen. And Jonathan was very gracious. I get introduced as the co-founder of City Year along with Michael, and get all this acknowledgement for what City Year has become. And the truth is, City Year has hundreds of co-founders. The truth is, what Michael and I did was just tap into a spirit of public service, a spirit of idealism, a spirit of people who want to be part of causes larger than themselves. It's like David said, what I found is most people really do want to be part of trying to change the world in whatever way they can. And we were just lucky we tapped into that. I think it's always there. And 2 quickly became 4, and then 4 became 8. And the truth is, what really made City Year happen was that there were young people, like the one sitting in this audience today, 22 years ago, who stepped forward. And this was at the height of sort of the me generation. My generation was branded the me generation. We rejected that. It's part of the reason we started City Year. Who stepped forward and said, "I'm going to give a year of my life." And that's really what made it happen. So I wrote the book first as a way to say thank you and to sort of share that sense of gratitude. I also wrote it to share some lessons learned. And I do think, and I agree with what David said, I think what's going on in the social entrepreneurship movement, in the service movement today, is some of the most exciting things that are happening all over the world. And I spent a year, I have a chapter in the book, I spent a year traveling the world, visiting social entrepreneurs and change makers. And this is a global phenomenon. It's not just an American phenomenon. And so I also wanted to share some lessons, because I started working on the book 3.5 years ago when I left City Year, and I was very concerned about where the country was at. And I thought, well, I've had this privileged experience. Maybe I could try to share some lessons that there is a better way. My own commitment to big citizenship started with my parents. My dad is an immigrant from Iran, and he came here, left a country of dictatorship for a country of freedom. And he raised me with this incredible perspective of, this is the greatest country in the world. The only one he could come to as a foreigner become a citizen, give back, participate, and try to make a difference. But he also raised me with a critical eye. My father comes from a country with thousands of years of history, and he's a big student of history. And he taught me as a little kid about a man named Mossadegh, who was the popularly elected prime minister of Iran, who was overthrown after he nationalized the oil fields for the benefit of the Iranian people by the British government or CIA. And so my dad taught me to love this country enough to want to help it live up to its ideals. My mother is Italian, and she's a nurse. My dad's a doctor, my mother's a nurse. They both went into medicine to save lives. And my mother, when my dad was more macro, my mother was more micro. She's the classic Italian. She will fall in love with you over the phone. And if she were here, she'd hug and kiss every single one of you. She'd tell you how beautiful you are. She'd ask you about your families. And whereas my dad was teaching me about democracy and justice, my mother was teaching me about people. And she taught me, Alan, every single person has a special gift to give. And you should try to see those gifts and literally try to love everybody. And so when I came across this idea of national service, it just clicked for me. It sort of met my dad's teachings about democracy. It's a way to make our democracy work because it gives young people, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, a chance to be a full-time, active-duty, big citizen and realize that they are powerful and can make a difference. And it turns on what I like to call their justice nerves. And you can use that energy and idealism of young people to make a huge impact. But it also, at the micro level, gives everybody a chance to share their gifts and reach their potential, which was what my mom taught me. And so I became passionate. I mean, one of the things you find about social entrepreneurs, it's almost like you have to do it. You just get thunderstruck by some idea, some notion that it's, and people say, well, you've made these sacrifices. The truth is, I've been blessed. I've been able to pursue the life I wanted to pursue. And then the next step in my journey happened on September 8th, 1979, when I first met Michael Brown. We were assigned to be roommates freshman year. I still don't know who put us together, but they certainly knew what they were doing because we both found out that we shared a passion for the 60s, the icons and the heroes, JFK, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and the ideals that they all stood for. We also, after about a week, confessed to each other that we were both Trekkies. We loved the show Star Trek because it was the most idealistic show on television. If you remember the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, it had the incredibly diverse crew. The Russians and Americans were working together. Everything had been worked out, and they were boldly going where no one had gone before. And we, had this passion. We found we had this passion for America and our democracy and this idea of national service. And so we began what began as a conversation and then, ongoing effort. And we actually stayed as roommates for the better part of 12 years. Until Michael finally married this incredible woman, Charlotte Mao, and then he kicked me out. But we had a 2-bedroom apartment, and he needed the space more, so I was okay with that, and I love Charlotte. But I share that because one of the things I've learned, and what I try to tell with the book, is that people come to me and say, I have an idea, I want to do something, I want to make an impact, I want to start an organization, etc. I always say, find a partner and build a team. Because no one changes the world by themselves. And it's all about the people who get involved, and I've seen that over and over. And that was a big reason why I wrote the book. Another inspiration for the book came from a story I heard about President Harry Truman. And President Truman was one of the most modest men to ever hold the office of president. He assumed it when FDR died. He didn't run for it at first. And on his last day in office, a reporter called out to him and said, Mr. President, what are you going to do now that you're leaving the highest office in the land? And Truman's responded right away, I'm not leaving the highest office. I'm assuming the highest office, that of citizen. And so I wrote the book as a way to say, imagine what our country would be if we all felt like we held an office. And we swore that oath to the Constitution and to that mission of America to form that more perfect union. What would our country be like? And if obviously, hopefully people would be involved in service, but also involved in politics. It's part of the reason I finally, I decided to jump into that Senate race a year ago. And involved in movements for change. And to try and stir that notion of it is big citizenship, it's people getting involved. The other reason I wrote the book, and that's sort of big citizenship at the micro level. The other reason I wrote the book at the macro level, and this really comes out of my experience as a social entrepreneur and being in this incredible movement and the service movement and really being exposed to just extraordinary people. And David's right, people like Wendy Kopp or Jeffrey Canada or Dorothy Stoneman or right here in Boston, Eric Schwartz or Earl Phelan, I could go on and on, should be celebrated on the covers of Time magazine and whatnot. But I wrote it because I also feel like there is a better way. We are in a time of real serious challenges and crises, and I think learning from the social entrepreneurship movement and how people are making change, learning from the service movement, seeing the dynamism that's happening in this country and all over the world, there are elements of a different approach to how we can solve problems. And I think, and that's a big reason why I wrote the book, is I don't feel like I have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we need a different kind of debate. And I think the American people know that. I mean, it's really interesting. We just had an election 2 days ago. And I think people are frustrated because the debate that comes out of Washington is too simplistic. One side seems to say government's the answer, the other side responds, no, government's the problem. And it's more complicated than that, and people know it's more complicated than that. And I think that part of the reason I wrote the book is from my experience in these movements is I think we need a different approach. We need a new governing philosophy, if you will, a new public philosophy that is different, that's more attuned to the 21st century. And David's right, this is, in some ways, there's always been social entrepreneurs, but there's something that's been happening over the past 30, 40 years, and I think you put it in great historical perspective. And so, I think we have to remind ourselves of what President Lincoln said. At a time of greater crisis, at the height of the Civil War, when we literally came apart and were killing each other, Lincoln said this: "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. Our occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise to the occasion. As our case is new, we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." Social entrepreneurs wake up every single day thinking anew and acting anew. They don't take the world as it is. They say, here's a better way, and I'm going to invent a better way, and I'm going to work with other people to do it. So what are some of the things that I've learned that I think could be a different approach? Well, first of all, that I sort of have labeled big citizenship. We have to have an economy that works for everybody. We have to reclaim our America as the opportunity society that brought my dad here and my Italian grandparents here, the search of the American dream. We can't, especially in the 21st century, we can't afford to have anybody on the sidelines. Secondly, our first instinct, whenever there's a problem or a challenge or an opportunity, should be to ask, what's the role of citizens? How do we get people involved? I'd love to see AmeriCorps get to 1 million people a year. If you did that, every generation would become a greatest generation, and you'd have this force of people directly attacking problems. I also think we need to get more people involved in politics. Definitely voting, and we had this big election, but the turnout wasn't that high. And backing candidates, they believe in, are running for office themselves, and also people getting involved in movements, and I'll come back to that because citizen movements are key. Secondly, what I've learned is it's entrepreneurs and innovators that drive change, and we need to have a system that encourages entrepreneurship and innovation and helps it to scale much faster. Part of the reason, what I learned when we travel the world, is part of the reason America so dominates the global economy is we have developed a pretty good system on the private sector. People come from all over the world. Sergey Brin, who's from Russia, came here to found Google, for example. And there's a system with capital markets and attention and being able to hire people out of business schools and all kinds of support that if you've got a great idea, you can get it scaled up. We need that similar system on the social side. Third thing is, I think we need a different role for government. And I've learned this working, my work had a big impact in terms of how national service policy got decided, and it was key to scaling city here. I'm not an anti-government person. It's through government that we collectively express our will. But in the 21st century, government should have a different role. It should be more transparent, and with the internet we can do that. It should be more accountable. It should be more catalytic. It should help set the rules of the game and ensure there's a fair marketplace in both the private and social sector. And it should help to scale up what works and be willing to shut down what doesn't. We do need to think anew and act anew. Fourthly, I think we need more public-private partnerships. Our challenges are so great that we can't afford to have any sector sit on the sidelines. And again, if you look at the world of social entrepreneurs, they're all doing public-private partnerships. They've all figured out a way to bring the private sector, business sector, the government, and the social sector together. We started City Year all with private money because there wasn't anything like AmeriCorps. And then we played a role in helping to inspire AmeriCorps. But without AmeriCorps, City Year wouldn't be in 20 cities today, or internationally in South Africa, and most recently in the United Kingdom. Because that government financing gave us sort of that mezzanine capital to help us scale up. And so I think that's part of the solution. And again, social entrepreneurs get that. They go in all sectors. They're as comfortable from the street corner, and that's critically important because most people start at the grassroots level. That's how we started, because that's where change really starts to happen. But they're also comfortable in the boardroom and in the halls of Congress. And finally, I think we need to recapture our sense of common purpose. that we're all in this together. And again, you can take any social entrepreneur organization, and they are about common purpose. They're about bringing people together. Our Constitution doesn't begin with the words, I, a member of the United States, in order to get more for me. If it did, I don't think it would have lasted that long. It begins with these three incredible, powerful, beautiful, and at the time, amazingly radical words. We the people. When our founding mothers and fathers wrote that down, every other country in the world was governed by a king, a queen, a dictator, a shah. We the people. And what's the mission? In order to form a more perfect union. And that's what social entrepreneurs are trying to do every single day. And we need to recapture that sense of common purpose. And finally, part of the reason I wrote the book is to remind us all, if you study our history, it's always been citizens that have driven great change in this country, and indeed around the world. Right here in Massachusetts, it was the citizen soldiers who put down their pitchforks and picked up their muskets to take on the greatest empire of the day, and were successful in the revolution. It was the abolitionists, again, leading here in Massachusetts, and the hundreds of thousands who shed untold blood and gave the last full measure of devotion that made the Emancipation Proclamation possible. It was the suffragettes who spent 75 years pushing for women to have the right to vote, who forced Wilson to embrace the 19th Amendment. It was the greatest generation. Our grandparents and great-grandparents, who we still revere 4 generations later, because they collectively worked to survive the Depression and then take on Hitler and the Nazis, and were successful. It was the civil rights activists who did the marches and the freedom rides and the voter registration drives that made the 64 Civil Rights Act and 65 Voting Rights Act possible. So it's always been citizens. It was the citizens who rose up in Soweto in South Africa in 1976, the young people. So this is not just here, it's around the world. And so part of the reason I wrote the book, and what I've learned from my own experience, is to remind people that at the end of the day, we live in a democracy, we're lucky, it is up to us. And if each of us does our part, that's how we're going to complete that journey. And we're not going to all be Mother Teresa's or Martin Luther King's, but if we each do what we can to be involved in service, to make sure we participate in our political and democratic process, and then pick a cause, whatever you're most passionate about, and join with others in a movement for change, that's how we're going to reach our potential. And that's what I've learned from being part of these incredible movements. Wow.
Pamela, the name of your organization is so intriguing. I just love thinking about it, universal giving, and would love to know, where that concept came about from, and thinking about it in connection with Alan, what Alan has been talking about and David has been talking about in terms of globalization and how our community and our fellow man and our neighbor isn't necessarily just the person next door, but that more and more we need to sort of think about the whole world, the whole universe, as being our backyard in a sense, and in our community. So tell us about your work and your life.
Yes, and I think with the word, you're right, with the title, with universal giving, we do think of the site as being country to country, and part of what's so great about Universal is we start to go with Richard Branson doing things in space. Who knows who we'll meet out there? And it might be that college students are doing volunteer trips to Mars. We're open to that. So that's Universal Giving is very open about where we'll be going. But I think one of the things that Alan has mentioned is really about it can be the norm that people take action. And that's very much the vision of Universal Giving. It's to create a world where giving and volunteering are a natural part of everyday life. We look at it and we say, if you can pay for your cell phone, it's that important for you to text, then it's that important for you to volunteer. I mean, my goal, I'll feel like I will have completed universal giving when everyone gets their cell phone bill, their heating bill, and their volunteer registry of where they volunteered each month, that it's that important you think about it on your kitchen counter as that being something that important that you're recording. I think that when you look at being a social entrepreneur, what Alan and David have talked about, what you really need to do at the beginning, whether you become the Mother Teresa or not, and I would argue that every single act does make you a Mother Teresa. That sense of love and giving of your time, giving of your thoughts, giving of your talents and interests, everyone has that capability to be that. And I just say, before I kind of go into my presentation, I will share with you a brief story that I wrote called Philanthropy at the Dry Cleaners. Because I was rushing to get to work so I could do good, and I came into the dry cleaners, and just came in and gave my ticket and rushed out, and just all of a sudden I thought, wait a minute, am I someone who gives from 9 to 5? And do I check out at 5 p.m.? Who is this woman? The next time I came in there, I found out her name. Her name is An, A-H-N. She's from Vietnam. She has children. She's been running this for about 13 years. We had a conversation, and I was present with her. Part of giving is being present with your time, present in any interaction, and whether you're walking down the street or speaking with homeless people, it doesn't always have to be a formal volunteer opportunity. So I think, we can really look at giving. For me, it was a big lesson learned that here I was going and being, energetic social entrepreneur, but I was not giving to that person right in front of me. And what an opportunity that means, that giving is completely democratic and available for everyone. You can be doing that at every moment. And I'd say that extends too to our family and our home first. How you treat your partner at home, how you treat your roommates, your children, the people in your apartment building. We really have to take service to not just the formal opportunity, but at first serving the people who are around us. And I do watch that as a social entrepreneurship professional, that we're not just only doing formal activities, but we carry that principle of loving and giving in our lives. So I think as a social entrepreneur, to really become an effective social entrepreneur, one of you said that it's almost like you have to do it. There's just a drive to do it. And I would say it is not a choice. I mean, when I was starting Universal Giving, I had billboards up in my room that I put, "You will not give up." And I was shaking in my boots, but I did not have a choice. I did not feel I had a choice to start Universal Giving. No matter how much fear, no matter how much concern I had, it was so clear to me from my life experiences and my personal stories that this is where I needed to go. And that's ideally what you can find. Now, I'll be honest with you, I left 4 jobs in, I think, about 18 months before finding that. So don't be daunted by the different pathways you have to take to find that unique pathway for you. But it's about your personal story. And we hear a lot about CSR, corporate social responsibility, and we'll talk about that as well. But the concept I'd like to introduce you today is PSR. It's personal social responsibility. We start with that first. We don't have to rely on companies to just do good. We start with our sense of social responsibility first. And for me, that is me in the red shirt at age 12 in Mexico with Mom, Dad, Allison, my older sister, who will not forgive me for continually showing this picture, and our Mexican friend, who I don't remember his name. And we were on a family vacation in Mexico. And I will tell you, one of the things that Alan spoke about was that it takes a team. And one of the things I would encourage to budding social entrepreneurs is that team is not only your paid team, it is your informal advisors and network. It could be your family, it could be an old friend. Make sure you have those informal advisors not formally associated with your organization to support you as you launch your venture. I believe you'll need that, not just a good team. It's a team outside and a team inside. And my team have definitely been Alex and Wally in this photo. They have been married 47 years. They are best friends with a spark, and they are 2 of my best friends. And I go down every Sunday and spend my full Sunday with him. I do not work on Sundays, and we just spend our days walking and having meals together and being present with each other. They have supported me unconditionally, and you need to find those kind of support networks in your life. And when you do, you also realize you're not the only person launching your venture. It is a village that's launching your venture, and to be respectful of that. Well, we were in Mexico, and my dad and I were at a marketplace where they were selling gifts for tourists, and we walked down this cul-de-sac. And at the age of 12, I saw every begging, starving, maimed child, dirty, unwashed. And I was just holding my dad's hand, and I just said, how can this be? How could you not tell me this? And he said, honey, you're 12. And yet at that point, this is what flashed across my mind. I could not accept that. And from that day on, I just went and started volunteering in East Palo Alto, giving out clothes, working with people who were on AFDC, which is now TAMP welfare payments, working in handing out meals, whatever I could do When I got to Duke, I saw a need there that people didn't know about the deaf community and sign language. I went to Gallaudet. I learned sign language in the elementary levels and taught it at Duke. When I got older, I started volunteering abroad. And so what happened is this concept of something that was unacceptable, I would encourage you to try to find what's unacceptable to you. What is that? And there's no right or wrong. It could be human rights. It could be animals. It doesn't have to be as drastic as human poverty. It can be rights for women in your local community. It doesn't have to be international either. For me, my personal story, I think on the international front, starts with glue. I was in El Salvador, serving in the earthquake crisis at that time. And as I was walking down the streets, I was like, why are there all these men passed out on the streets with handkerchiefs and dirty cloths over their nose? What is that? They were so miserable that they were stealing glue from the shoe factory and getting high and passing out on the glue because they were so miserable. So you think about people's lives, and in many developing nations, there are no resources. And that's what comes to that devastation where people want to be able to check out. One of the other riveting experiences for me was in India. Now, this is a pretty challenging story, so I just want to prepare you all. But in some of the local villages in India, having girls as babies is not popular at all, to the extent that they are often boiled to death once they are born in pots on the stove. So that is another experience that I saw that shaped me. And this is still going on today, not in all places, but in some isolated village areas. And the third is Chung Ek in Cambodia, where what you are looking at now is basically it's a memorial to many of the people who died during Pol Pot's regime. And these are all the skulls and bones from many of those people. And there are many green fields around, and all the green fields, they're extremely green because that's where many of the people who couldn't fit into this temple are buried. So it is, during that time, I volunteered on all these places. I learned a lot about the cultures. I learned a lot about the needs about people. And from that, I had a decision to make as a social entrepreneur. I can either go and be a Peace Corps volunteer and give of my life on the micro level, like your mother, or I can go do something on the macro level, which helps other people give of their lives individually and leverage what I know to get thousands of people involved, giving and volunteering all across the world. So, as you can see, your personal story determines your course as a social entrepreneur. Look back. Look back before you step forward. What is it about you that makes you and shapes you into this social entrepreneur? So, there are different definitions of social entrepreneurship. For me, as a social entrepreneurship, I believe it does involve at least two things. One, for us at Universal Giving, is a public service. We try to create something that's free for everyone. We are specifically a nonprofit, and I believe social entrepreneurship organizations absolutely can be for-profit and nonprofit. But we're specifically a nonprofit because we're dealing with giving on the international front. And when you're dealing with giving, you want as much transparency as possible, and we thought that nonprofit would provide the purest brand. We're not trying to profit off of the giving. We don't take a cut in the donation. So that providing a public service that's free for everyone is important as a social entrepreneur. But second is I do believe that the purest form of social entrepreneurship is that you generate revenue. Again, you could be a for-profit or a nonprofit, but I guess I would argue a little bit with David that dynamism becomes a word that can be defined by anyone, and I don't believe all nonprofits or for-profits are social entrepreneurs. And so how do you define that dynamism that I believe David is saying is right? To me, it's more specific in saying, I want to be responsible enough that I can help generate revenue to support our efforts with something that is mission-driven. So I have a public service and also something that generates revenue. So what that translates into with Universal Giving, you can come on here, you can donate, you can volunteer, and it allows you quick access of innovative ways to give. And so there's different vehicles to do this. There's what's called gift packages, quick gifts, gift certificates, and gift registries. And this just gives you some practical examples about how you can get involved. The first one that with gift packages is where you can give a gift. $50 feeds a child porridge for a month in many developing nations, and even more. And you can give it as a gift, an anniversary gift, a birthday gift. And so what we're seeing in this tough economy is people are still giving for the holidays or for birthdays, but they don't necessarily want to give a $100 shirt, but they want to give something. So if I can give $50 as a donation, people will often give that. And we're seeing that actually rise on our site. That has not gone down during this economy. Second is, well, that's one way. The other way of a gift package is to do something lighter. So not everything, again, has to be about poverty. So one of our most popular gift packages is sponsoring an orphan chimpanzee. Maybe not many of you knew that there were orphan chimpanzees, but now you know, and you can give them as gifts. The second is with quick gifts. This, I think, meets our very, very busy society. Holidays are coming up. People want to be able to give gifts. Employers are actually doing this, where they can give gifts to multiple people. And they can order, let's say they want to order 15 of the orphan chimpanzees, and it goes to Dear Amy, Dear Drew, Dear Alan. Oh, my goodness, we even have your name on here. And you can customize the message to them. So this quick gifts allows you to give a gift package multiple times to different people and be able to do your giving in a very quick and effective manner. We also have gift certificates that if you want to choose your own project on the site, you can choose that project as well. And then also finally is gift registries, which have become increasingly popular. Very interesting that for weddings or for graduations, people are no longer willing to get material gifts. Many, many of my colleagues and peers who are getting married are saying, we don't want the physical gifts. Some of them who are getting married later are saying, I already have enough. But I'm going to list all the donations that I want you to give to, and could you go onto the registry and please give to the donations to these different nonprofits. And so these are just some different ways for you to see how varied the giving can be, how many different ways that you can give, and that it doesn't have to be something you have to start on your own, but there's a way that you can begin being a giver now. So that's our public free service, and I wanted to give that to you as a very tangible example as to what you can do. Second is we have a second service, Universal Giving Corporate. This helps scale corporate social responsibility programs worldwide. So this is the element that actually generates revenue for us. We go into strategy with the companies to help them figure out how their employees can give and volunteer across the world. We help them figure out their operations and scale them. Cisco, one of our partners, we help scale their corporate social responsibility programs in 40 countries across the world. We help customize it country by country. How do you need to treat giving in India different than you do in the US? How does the concept of volunteerism translate in China versus in Tanzania? Very, very different how those translate. So we help them scale according to legal issues and culture and make sure that that all works appropriately for them. We also do NGO vetting. We go in and we vet NGOs, 15-stage quality model based on what I've learned from being in the venture capitalist community in Silicon Valley. Now, this NGO vetting is something we provide for you for free when you come to the site. But for companies, we charge, and we do even more due diligence for the companies. Basically, we look at it very much as venture capitalists do. They like a good business idea, and the next thing they say is, who's the management team? That's the argument I have with a lot of the rating systems out there. Sure, we look at finances and overhead and all of that, but venture capitalists don't invest in numbers. They invest in people after a good idea. It's the same thing with us. We get on the phone or we go and we visit our partners. Less is more. I believe the web is moving towards people are saying, I want quality information, less information, and quality information. And that's what we provide. So universal giving for the company provides an increased corporate brand image. This would be a reason why the companies would do this. It provides better employee attraction and retention, especially with the young generation these days. One of the top questions I'll ask employers are, what do you do for your community? It also helps with clients. Clients want to know that you're doing good across the world. And so we see this, that we help a company's bottom line. So for us, a company's bottom line, you've got to make a profit, you have to have product, and you need to serve your employees, your clients. Make sure you have volunteering, donations, and product donations, because we believe that your bottom line is your top line. Well, your bottom line is not just financial, it is all of these things makes you a great company. Being your top line is that you are caring about all these components of the community. So what I encourage you to think about for you as a social entrepreneur or someone who just wants to give, go back to your personal story. What is unacceptable to you? What burns within you that just doesn't feel as right within the world? And think about what that story is and figure out how you can translate that into your day-to-day life, whether it's saying hi to a homeless person on the street, committing to speak more kindly to your partner at home, or actually starting your own venture. So I'd ask you to live your personal story in that day-to-day, and I want to thank you.
Well, in thinking about all of your comments, I'm drawn to think about an exhibit that we have in the lobby, which is called Life of Service. And in fact, it's really been a theme for our programming this year. And it treats Mary Baker Eddy's life of service and also how people in the world today are going about serving their communities, serving the world. And a principle that came out to us about Mary Baker Eddy's approach to service was that she very much wanted both giver and recipient to feel as if they were equals. She didn't want to go about it in a way that made it feel like these people were in any way dependent or lesser than because they needed to receive her beneficence. And so she treated it very much as neighbor to neighbor, even if the people were sort of a little bit further afield. And I'm just wondering, in your experience covering these stories, and Alan, in your experience, Pamela, in your experience, how you go about sustaining and encouraging that kind of relationship so that people, you and the people who are the beneficiaries of what you do, really sort of come together and you become more connected as equals as opposed to one being in a superior place to the other.
I always go back to some of the stories that I've researched because my head is just a bunch of stories basically, and I think we're all products of we're all essentially dependent on all the other people who helped us become what we are. If you speak English very, very well, or you grew up in a house that has lots of books, and people spoke as, there's a study that shows middle-class kids get spoken 3 times as many words to them as kids from low-income families. So they're getting 3 times the number of words spoken to them before they even enter kindergarten. These kids are on a different educational trajectory. So to fully appreciate how much you've been given to get to where you are, so that when you are encountering someone who's at a different level of income, who's needy in a different way, I think understanding that is the deepest way to create that kind of empathy, because I think it's none of us gets to any level of success really on our own achievements. There's no such thing as a self-made man. I'm sorry about the American dream and all that, but we are so, everything that happens to us is so contingent on 100 other things going right in the course of the day, whether it's, whether you live today or whether we're still alive tomorrow is contingent on whether the meat inspector in somewhere in the United States did a good job, right? I mean, we are so dependent on so many other people. And I think to remember that, and to actually have, one of the great things that's happening now in the field of business is this thing called supply chain transparency, or what's called traceability. It's actually much bigger in Europe, but if Americans start demanding this from their retail chains, we will have it here more. But basically it means that if you go into a store, let's say it's, Banana Republic or Whole Foods, and there's a little barcode on the thing you're going to buy, you can click, you can put it up to a little machine, and that machine will show you all the different people throughout the entire chain who had a hand in making that thing happen. So it might have been the person who picked the cotton, the person who worked in the factory where the cotton was sewed, the person who worked in the shipping company where that was packed and shipped. And you can literally see the whole supply chain, and you kind of get the sense of how the world is conspiring to get you a $12 t-shirt. And I think these simple things that make it clear to us how much gratitude we really need to have for just the simplest things that go right in our lives will go a long way towards that. And the cool thing is that very creative people in business now and marketing and all that are figuring out how to make that story, how to tell that story in a way that we can actually digest on a day-to-day basis. And it will make the world much smaller, and I think it will let a lot more empathy flow.
Yeah, I would add, Jonathan, I think everything David said is right on the money. And I think the philosophy is absolutely right. I think Mary Baker Eddy was absolutely right. And what we've tried to do at City Year is we've collected what has now become called founding stories, where we have stories that come from all different cultures and quotes. And the very first one that I shared with the core members on our very first day is the old Native American prayer that says, "Great Spirit, grant that I shall not criticize my brother or sister until I've walked a mile in his or her moccasins." You know, the modern version of that is walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. And, you know, City Year is incredibly diverse. We have young people from all different backgrounds, racial and ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, educational levels, faiths, geographies, et cetera. And so it starts there. So right away, you're in a very diverse group that you're serving with. And one of the things that we try to encourage in our core members is, you know, always start by walking in the other person's moccasins, the people you're serving with, the people you're serving, the people you meet, because you can learn something from everybody. And it does instill that sense of empathy. So that's how we've tried to do it. And also we try to serve with, not to or for. And often, you know, what I've learned is when you give, you get. And if you talk to City Year core members, they'll tell you that they learn as much, they get inspired by the children they work with, the other people they serve. But I think the philosophy is right on the money. If you have an attitude of like, I'm here to help you, or you need me, as opposed to we're here together, I don't think that's as powerful.
I think we also have to look at different levels of poverty. You know, usually when we look at poverty, we think immediately it's monetary or that people don't have enough food or clothing. But there is a very strong emotional poverty, spiritual poverty. There's a lot of people who are high net worth donors or come from a lot of wealth, financial wealth or means, who are not wealthy in terms of relationships, wealthy in terms of experiencing love or giving in their lives. So, I mean, there are a lot of donors that we've experienced who are volunteering and giving and just saying, this is, you know, transformational for me. This has changed my life. And I think it impacts how they view the world and realize what is most meaningful to them. And you see it time and time again. You mentioned it as yourself. You said aside from your family, you know, that the organization meant so much to you, but family and those relationships came first. And so we have to really look at what poverty is. And so when people ask us for tips when they're going to volunteer or give abroad, I usually just say the first thing you should do is listen. Because we think of it as such activism, but before you take action, you should really listen, and you should do together. And it should be an act of creation together. And I don't really think that, I don't know, to me, I really think it's 50-50, and I do think that the giver really, really does receive more. And I'll give you a quick example of that. Just so struck in Cambodia by all the tragedy that they've been through, and yet many of the families are spending so much time together, and the divorce rate is low. And it's just, there's a sense of family, there's a sense of tradition. They are eating 2-hour meals together, whereas, you know, often we're eating in our cars. So I think we really have to look at what is poverty, what is service, and realizing every time you go in there with the utmost humility to listen first and then create together and then be prepared to be changed.
Well, we want to open up.
Can I add something to that?
Sure, absolutely.
Just because I think that what you're saying is so important, and in my own, from my own, the work that I've done looking at microcredit and the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, I mean, one of the things that struck me when I was living in Bangladesh researching that was how, even the poorest woman in the poorest village in Bangladesh, and when I went to Bangladesh, I didn't know much about the country. I mean, I really imagined poor people the way they were shown on the news reports after a cyclone, just sort of like begging for, rice bags to be thrown from helicopters from the, Marines helping them. I didn't have this image of the extraordinary level of competence and capacity in these very, very poor people who may not be able to read and write. And I saw when this organization structured an approach that assisted them and allowed them to take control of their lives, you immediately saw how creative people really were. So I really have this sense, and I've also seen in a lot of organizations that work with disabled people, everybody comes in and thinks, oh, I'm going to support this disabled person, and they end up realizing that the biggest contribution is recognizing that that their lives have been transformed, their communities have been transformed by including people who see the world very, very differently, who prioritize things very, very differently in some cases. So I think it's very important to recognize that almost everybody we look at has more capacity than we think they do.
Well, we have this great treasure on stage with us, and want to make it available to you, and any questions or comments that you might have that you want to share. We have a stand-up mic here in the center of the room, so please feel free to come up and address a question to the panel collectively or any individual.
I've got a quick question following what you said. The Bible says it's better to give than to receive. I heard what you said about Mary Baker. Mayor Angelo said, I have found that among its other benefits, giving liberates the soul of the giver. What is the simple message to the receiver? We are talking about what the giver gets. What does the receiver get? The Bible says better to give than to receive. You have said it's better to recognize the potential of the receiver. But I'm trying to figure out what is the principle that is shared with the receiver.
I don't know of any relationship where there is just a giver and a receiver. And, because I was talking to Casey, who's a City Year Corps member before, and I said, what's been the best thing about your experience? And she said, walking down in the hallways in the school where she works at, the Boston Renaissance Charter School, and all of the kids rushing up to her, saying her name, saying thank you. They're giving. They're giving their love, their joy, their happiness, their progress. So, I guess what I would say to the receiver is, receive generously and don't, be open to receiving. And also as you receive, you're giving. Nobody, that's why I almost question the premise, because I don't know of a relationship where it's just one way. When you're involving human beings, it's always you give, you get. And people don't give unless they are, they're getting something in return, which is, expressing their ideals or their love or their sense of making a difference. So I think the wisdom in that statement is, it's better to give than to receive, is to let people, is that when you start giving, that's when you actually receive the most. That's why I've seen that when people do service, especially, part of the reason I believe in national service so strongly is when people do it at a young enough age, it turns on what I like to call their justice nerves. Because once you come face to face with injustice, whether it's kids who aren't getting the right education in school or people who are homeless or hungry or whatever, you can't walk away from that. And people do. I've seen it over and over. And they continue to give because they are getting. Often more than they give.
I think another thing too is that we often look at, well, first of all, we need to look at what giving is. Giving can be money, it can be love, it can be appreciation. So you can have a relationship, as Alan is saying, where this party is giving certain resources and this one is giving certain resources. So they're both giving and receiving at the same time. One of the things that I've really been learning a lot recently in my life is, let's say this is you, and you end up giving to this person, person number 1, person number 2, person number 3. I think we make a mistake, is the expectation to think, okay, now this person owes me this, or this person owes me this. We need to give freely, which he was talking about liberates the soul, right? We give freely. But where the giving comes back to us is not linear necessarily from person 1, 2, and 3. We might be given to by 4, 5, and 6. Here, we have to let go where the giving and receiving comes from. And sometimes we get stuck in, I gave to this person and they need to give back to me, and it's not like that. This quote about liberating the soul is, I'm going to give freely to these people. And I know that the divine law that Jonathan was talking about, or divine law of love or principle or whatever you want to call it, is going to automatically bring in some kind of giving and receiving back to me, but it's not contingent on person. It's not from X person. We need to give freely, which liberates us, and then giving will be given to us, but we can't outline how that happens.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak. It was amazing to hear all your stories and very inspiring. And I had a question, which is not quite as deep as the previous, but I was just curious, a few of you mentioned the importance of finding a team and of finding people to help you along a journey. And I was wondering how you went about doing that. Did it just kind of happen? Did you have to go seek out these people? And really how you found them?
Want to take that one first, Pamela?
Well, I will tell you. What's your name? Matt. What a great question. And I will say that you're always finding your team. You're always finding your network. So many times we think, I need to find it, and I stop. I don't ever stop thinking about growing my team, expanding my team, going back and helping my current team really excel. We actually have this at work with our executive team. We talk about the fact that we don't want to have the golden handcuffs for our team. We want the golden wings, that we are actually giving them, enough compensation, enough benefits, enough work-life balance so that they feel free to fly. So I don't think you ever stop that. I know for myself personally as a social entrepreneur, I think you grow in leadership and management. I kind of start to laugh when I think about some of the challenges I went through. And in fact, I'm writing about them now because I read every single management book. And a lot of them were, and not bad at all, but were by white men in their 60s, good lessons learned, but maybe not always applicable to me in my 20s and 30s starting social entrepreneurship organizations. So we need more leadership thought out there to continue discussing how we can build teams. I think your team has to include your board of directors, your board of advisors. I think another thing on board of advisors, people sometimes look at them as nameplates. We actively are involved with our board of advisors. They advise me equally as my board does. They might not meet as often, but I am on the phone with them, calling them, engaging them. So when you build those teams, stay engaged with them, Matt, not just build them and put them on the letterhead. I think that's part of the challenge that we face sometimes. And then I would, again, stress that informal network. I went through a very challenging time as a social entrepreneur. I lost my entire executive team. One was because we're very kind of women-friendly. We have a lot of women who have kids at home. One of my most trusted women decided that she just was burnt out and just wanted to be a full-time mom and did not want to come back ever. I lost really strong members of my executive team, and I had to rebuild again. And when I let go, and when you really let people find whatever is the right pathway for them, literally within a very short time, I was able to rebuild that team. And I didn't want to rebuild it, but sometimes you have to let people go and wish them well on their pathway. Get to know your team's goals. I have a sheet that says goals to the CEO that people can fill out, so I actively know what their goals are to the extent that they have nothing to do with universal giving. Make sure when you are building your team that you talk about their goals outside of universal giving. So we are very clear. One of my team members wants to be a professional writer. I am constantly thinking when I come across publicists, things like that, could I provide an introduction to her? When we have our team meetings, every single team member presents and runs them. It's not just our executive team who runs those team meetings. Everyone gets a chance to lead. And the first thing they have to do is say something that's completely unrelated to universal giving. So I have learned about people's cats who like to drink out of faucets. I have learned about people who have done rodeo dress-up cowboy festivals. I mean, it's quite fascinating how rich your team is. Get to know them. Express interest in them. And even if they don't always stay with you, there'll be a wonderful sense of consideration and giving and respect that you don't know how that will come back someday in your life. And besides, it's just the right thing to do, too.
Yeah, what I add to that, Matt, is, I mean, sometimes it's luck. Like, as I said, I was assigned to be roommates with Michael. And that was just, divine intervention, whatever you want to call it. But it's, the way to find your team is to put your idea out there. Whatever you want to do, and let people know about it. And also network your friends. I mean, when Michael and I were starting City Year, so it was first me and Michael, and then I reached out to Jennifer Epplett-Riley, who I'd met while I was in college. She was dating another one of my roommates. And then we put the word out, and then our fourth partner was Neil Silverson, who I didn't know at all, but he was really good friends with a friend of Michael who he'd gone to summer camp with. And then one of the things we started to do when we were first starting City Year is we would sort of just have open meetings and invite people to come and say, do you want to be part of this? And then it sort of just grew from there. Also put the word out. I mean, one of the most important people, who helped to found City Year was Kristen Atwood, who I didn't know at all. None of us knew her. But we had this 4-page description of City Year. And this was before the internet, when it was a lot harder. And we sort of sent it around to all these places. Somehow she got one. She read it and said, I have to be part of this. And, she was the first recruitment director. And we couldn't even hire her. We didn't have any money. And we said, well, we'd love to hire you. We don't have any money, but we promise we'll pay you as soon as we get some money. And she said, I'll take the job anyway. And she recruited the first corps and, has been instrumental. So I'd say, put your idea out there. You're going to have an amazing year this year. You're going to meet a lot of great people. It's your friendships. And the other thing is, don't be afraid, I think what Pamela said about sort of your external team and mentors. Don't be afraid to be entrepreneurial and to seek out mentors. I mean, I'll tell you a very quick story. Hubie Jones, who's now at City Year, who's one of the leaders of social justice in this community. I knew about him because I grew up watching the program 5 on 5. He was on TV every Sunday. And I thought, this guy's brilliant. When we were first starting City Year, we got to meet him. He was a dean at the School of Social Work at Boston University. And so I thought, well, how am I going to meet Hubie Jones? Well, deans have office hours. Now, I didn't go to Boston University School of Social Work, but I found out where you sign up. And I signed up for an appointment, and I took the last one of the day. It was 15 minutes appointments, But I took the last one of the day thinking, well, maybe I'll get 20 or 25 minutes if I'm the last one. So I walked in there with Neil, and Hubie right away looks at us and, wait a minute, you don't go to school here. What are you doing here? And so we started, talking really fast. Well, we went to Harvard Law School and Harvard Business School. We've got this great idea for an urban Peace Corps, and we need your help. And then he sat back and said, okay, now what do you have? And then he started to listen. He spent 2 hours with us that night, partially because we were the last appointment, and he was intrigued about these young people who had this, vision. And from that moment, he became an extraordinary mentor for me. And he's been guiding me ever since, 23 years later. So it's also, don't be afraid to go out and ask people. We asked him. We said, we need your help. You know more about this city than anybody else around. And how are we going to be successful? So sometimes you have to be a little entrepreneurial and break the rules a little bit, too.
Hello, my name is Bill Pankey, and I have a question for the panel. What are the key elements of scalability and also sustainability?
That's a long question on both of those, but a great question, yes. Well, they're two very different. Scalability, I think every organization can define itself differently, but I do look at it as striving to create a model that is, 80% replicable, and trying to scale that across either your community or your world. Again, scalability, it could be something as simple as, I want to scale providing adequate health services within the 5 most populated suburbs of Boston. It doesn't necessarily need to be global, but it does need to be something that you can demonstrate a successful pilot and show and come up with the criteria for that pilot of whatever it is that's successful to you, 100 people served per community, 2 hours of time spent with them in tutoring, whatever it might be, and see if you can scale that program and make it consistent across other different sectors or cities or geographic regions. Now, it's also important when you're looking at that to look at scaling the operations and processes as well. And the reason why I say 80% is because you really need to make sure you take into consideration cultural mores, local distinctions. There's nothing, I don't believe, that can be 100% scaled. If you go in and try and implant a CSR, corporate social responsibility program from Tanzania, and do the exact same thing in Belgium or in Brazil, it's not appropriate. You can still have a core model of principles you believe in, but those would be some of the defining points, I would say, on scalability. Not certainly all of them, but it should be something that someone else can take once you've defined that model and use it and get to the same place quicker by what you've defined for them, but customize it for the local area. The second, on sustainability, that's very, very divergent, and I think it depends on the organization, and I can only really answer from my own experience. To me, what being sustainable is Universal Giving's goal is to be 100% sustainable from corporate revenue. That's what we believe is being sustainable. But you could argue that organizations, nonprofits that receive 60% of their funding from for-profit ventures or from revenue generation, that is a definition of sustainability. They're sustaining themselves through making money on a certain level. But sustainability to me really does point to the fact of not just getting donations, but to having a financial model that can help make sure that your organization generates revenue. And so that means selling a product or a service.
Can I just add to that? Actually, in my my newest book, I actually use the example of City Year to talk about what scale is at essence. Because there's different ways of thinking about scale. You could think of scale in the way you think of McDonald's, where you have a gazillion restaurants, or you could think of scale of impact, which is actually changing the way the society works. So if you look at, for example, City Year scaled to a certain point where it was working with thousands of people. But then Alan and Michael very consciously said, we want to change the approach to national service in the United States and actually globally. A national service has been around for 100 years. It's a very old idea. Lots of people on the political right and political left have said this is a great idea, but nobody had ever really figured out how do you actually make this an idea that really has teeth and works and can get through the machinery and really become national policy. And by having this demonstration of City Year and then very consciously working with President Clinton, sharing that technology, making sure that the City Year alumni were these extraordinary ambassadors for service, who really, really showed what a beautiful idea this is, and then very, very, making sure it got into academia, it got into the political system. Other organizations were able to take the lessons from it and apply them themselves. You had, like when President Obama signed the Kennedy Serve America Act, the Kennedy Hatch Serve America Act, which tripled national service in the United States, and you now have hundreds of thousands of people. That basically grew out of City Year's, Alan and Michael's conscious decision to say, hey, how do we use this as a demonstration model to influence people we don't control, which is one of the deepest definitions of what entrepreneurs do. They leverage resources that they themselves don't control, which is another way of saying get other people to do it for you. And in terms of sustainability, like I wrote this book about the Grameen Bank years ago about saying that there's this new idea, microfinance at the time, which was a fairly small idea. And everybody, at the time that I was writing my book, the Grameen Bank represented about 90% of all the microcredit loans in the world. So everybody said it's too big to fail. It was, at that time, it was too big to fail. If the Grameen Bank as an institution had stopped being sustainable then, probably the idea of microcredit would have collapsed. But today, the Grameen Bank represents maybe, 5% of all the microfinance loans in the world. It's gotten to the point where the idea has idea sustainability, which is to say, in Bangladesh alone, there are 700 micro loan lenders. If the Grameen Bank went out of business tomorrow with its 7 million clients, most of them would be picked up by other lenders probably relatively quickly. So you have deep sustainability there, which is to say other people understand this idea, they know how to make it work, and they know why it matters to make it work. And so the institution itself is not required. So in some ways, like individual trees are not sustainable. Trees fall and get absorbed, but forests can be sustainable. And so I think we need to think of sustainability as forests. We can't hinge them all, we can't pin our hopes on individual institutions.
Yes, please.
I would like to first thank the library again for putting a beautiful program on. This is really very special. Thank you for being here. And I would like also to compliment you, Pam, on your PSR reference, the personal social responsibility. That was very unique, very personal. I hadn't heard that before, but I compliment you on that. My question relates to the internet and the use of the internet. I just want to mention that because I want to build the case for it and then get your reaction to it. In being aware of this presentation tonight, then I'm kind of alert of what information is coming to me before the meeting. And yesterday, one of the pieces of information came to me was from something that I follow relating to corporate social responsibility and the communication, how corporations work in this area. And so this piece of information was an interview with a professor from Washington University, St. Louis, who's an expert in these fields. And the question that was posed to him, and it was really to get the answer they were looking for, how does this relate to corporate social responsibility and the communication? And so the question that was posed was, November 3rd, the day after the election, when you examine Obama's use as a candidate, Obama's use of the internet, did you notice any change after he went into office and how he used the internet? And the professor's analysis said, yes, of course. In his campaign, he was a real leader. He was a real social leader. And he created on the internet video clips which were interactive. And so people any place in the world anonymously could comment. And so the campaign staff monitored that, and that was a great influence on how they were acting. So then he said, now he's in office, and they stopped doing that. And they immediately got into trouble on the health care bill. And the president has said, well, they don't understand. I'm trying to communicate to them, they're not getting it. And the people said, wait a minute, we're getting it. We don't like the message. So this analysis that I was reading was, you've got to have the right connection between your audience, your target audience, or whoever you're working with. This, as you've demonstrated here, you're really talking about a global market here of who you're trying to work with and influence. And so the communication back and forth between them so that you're getting your message out and you're having a good communication back and participation. So I'd be interested in your comment on how do you see this working, not only in your own organization, very clearly, Pam, you're into the internet business by what you post here. But how do you see it as a panel? How do you see this working? Is it effective for the nonprofits you see? Is it effective for the big programs that you're aware of trying to solve some problems in the world?
You want to take that first?
Go ahead.
I can speak from my own experience as a writer. I put things out in the world and then I get feedback. And sometimes the feedback will come from hundreds of people, emails and comments and so forth. And I think that this is a sort of a microcosm of the problem that many organizations, including and President Obama is facing, which is how do you actually, now that we live in this world of two-way communication, newspapers don't just push out information, governments are trying to have this going, how do you actually manage these communication flows? I don't know if you've ever paid attention to a bulletin board conversation on an internet website. I've looked at hundreds of these. They can be really, really, really difficult to follow, where hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of people weigh in. And it's very, very difficult. How do you actually bring all those strands together into a focal point that you can actually act on? And I think this is a problem that's very new in history. I don't think we had two-way communication at this level. Well, we've only really had it now for, maybe 10 years, really. And so I think figuring out how to manage those systems and wade through that and figure out I think it's a really, really big organizational challenge. And certainly the media industry is struggling with that now. One of the things that seems to be working, and Wikipedia is probably the most successful at this, is they deputize a whole bunch of their readers. In the case of Wikipedia, I think it's more than 1,000, who are essentially co-editors, and their job is to manage flows so that they sort of create an intermediate step of people who can sort of help. I think in the campaign structure, that naturally occurs. Because campaigns have this. They have organizing committees at the level of cities, at the level of states and all that. And so I think it was very natural for the campaign to be able to manage the interactivity of the 13 million email list that President Obama had. I think once it got into the structure of the government, it was much more difficult because a lot of those volunteers went back to their work, their day-to-day jobs, and governments historically have not had these multi-tiered sort of deputized lower level people or multi-level people who can manage what is millions and millions of messages. So I think it's a new challenge in human history that will actually how we manage this challenge will ultimately make a big difference in how we run and how democracy functions. But it certainly hasn't been solved.
I think can I say one final thing? I think an important thing we have to look at is the internet is not a relationship. What's the most important thing when you just even living life or being a social entrepreneur is your relationships with people, whether it's with your team, your family. To me, the internet and communications is a tool to enhance the relationship, further the relationship, educate, share knowledge both ways. So I look a lot at the internet or these tools very much as how can this enhance the relationships? So whether you look at a political campaign to get elected to office or whether you're looking to pass legislation, I would use, or running an organization or an initiative, or Matt getting the message out to people you want to join your team, I would look at what are the most effective tools to communicate, to build relationships, build your relationship. And so that's what I would focus on. One of the slides that I've presented on in the past is that it's got this big circle with all these different kinds of, you've got Universal Giving Twitter, Pamela Twitter, Universal Giving Facebook, Pamela Facebook, Universal Giving Blog, Pamela Blog. You've got, LinkedIn. You have all these different ways. And what we encourage people to do is whatever message you're trying to get out, figure out what your strategy is in using the internet to communicate that. If you want to help get the story out about something, is it better to tweet about it every morning at a certain time and get a following about Darfur and be able to tweet through your personal account and write on your blog? Maybe you don't need to use LinkedIn for that. Maybe you don't use Facebook for that. I would look at the strategy of what the internet can be used in order to enhance communication that will build the relationship, because I think that's where the technology and what David was talking about, he's really talking about building relationships and knowledge, but not about replacing that. And I don't ever look at the internet as a vacuum of something new. It's just a new tool to help us build those relationships.
The only thing I would add on that is I think it's an incredibly powerful tool, and I agree with everything that both David and Pamela said, and we're just at the beginning of this. I'm into citizen movements and citizen action, and as a way to drive democracy and to drive change. And it's what's possible now, because of the internet and everything that's flowing from it, is unprecedented in human history. People's ability to organize. I mean, Obama got elected because of the internet. If there wasn't any internet, Obama wouldn't have been elected. Raising money, mobilizing people, etc. But that's just one example. I think about my father's country in Iran. There was an election there a year and a half ago, and it was stolen by Ahmadinejad. And there was this green movement that lasted for over a year until it was brutally crushed. And it was Twitter that was facilitating these flash mobs that would say, we're going to all show up in the streets to protest. And somebody was smart enough in our State Department to call. They were supposed to shut down. They called and said, don't shut down. So even in Iran, where they're trying to control everything, China is trying to, it's like you said, you used to have to smuggle in cassettes. I think that we're going to see increasing democracy and increasingly empowered democracy because of the internet. And it facilitates, it is about facilitating, it just can't be online. But what the internet is most powerful is to facilitate relationships and facilitate people to coming together and finding shared interests and then taking shared action. So, and we're just at the cutting edge of it now. I mean, and the amazing thing is the younger generation, the millennials really get this. And there's all kind of movements that millennials are involved in because they use Facebook and Twitter and, the internet to organize. And it's very, very exciting.
All right, we'll take our final question.
That's a lot of pressure. First of all, I want to thank you all. It's very informative and also inspiring. I am a graduate student in an MBA program, so it's particularly inspiring to me. My question is for you, David. There was news on BBC just recently, I heard it last night, on BBC's broadcast last night about entrepreneurship and the concern of there's a number of suicides being reported for families that are using micro lending and microfinance, and something, I don't have the exact figure, but it was something out of the ordinary. And so there's recent legislation that's just been instituted that has, I guess, put controls on those members of the lending institutions going out and checking every week to see, in order to keep up with payments. And it was said that the families, they were talking about the pressures, but that in truth, a lot of them have been paying on time. I am just curious, this recent news, how is it going to impact? The idea of microfinance is so popular in these countries. It does make a huge impact in many ways. It is the next stage to a rising middle class. It is the grassroots of feeding a whole family and giving a sense of, freedom and capability and capacity. It's a very important part and huge vehicle for difference. How is this going to affect, if anything?
Well, so I don't know this specific story, but I do think that this is really, microfinance is, and it's interesting, it's an idea that's now been around for 30 years, so you can see the whole trajectory of an idea, but it's very possible that it could be going into a really major crisis in the next couple of years. Because what has happened with microfinance is that an idea that largely grew out of philanthropic motives. All of the early microfinance organizations, including the Grameen Bank, got almost all of their money either from governments or philanthropy initially. At a certain point, they started realizing that, poor people are actually really reliable. They pay back their loans. And so there was this movement that mostly in the 90s where people said, we should commercialize this. And so you had people commercializing it, then you had people getting profitable, then you had people getting very profitable, and then you had IPOs. The first one was Compartamos in Mexico, where the company was valued at, in the billions after it went public, and was earning tens of millions of profit and was charging interest rates at over 100%. In my view, this was, first of all, it shouldn't be legal, I don't think. I would consider this predatory lending. I wouldn't call it microfinance. In India, SKS also just had an offering, and they also raised quite a lot of money, and the founders became millionaires and all this. And there's a lot of people in one microfinance camp that say this is really great. Once it becomes a normal business, then all of the capital markets will begin considering poor people as, quote, an asset class that you can lend to, and then of course you can securitize the lending to this class. We've heard this story before, right? What happens when we securitize mortgages and all that? What happens when capital flees and suddenly dries up, like as we've seen in the United States, where you have credit dries up very quickly? In the United States, people ask to extend unemployment insurance of the government when that happens. In Bangladesh and in India, they of course cannot do that. So you have a potentially really major crisis if microfinance really becomes driven by this capitalist impulse. And I'm not saying that it can't be a business. What I'm saying that in the future, it has to be a different kind of business. If it continues to operate based on the traditional market principles, which is to maximize profits, it will start doing the normal things that business people do when they try to maximize profits, which is to lend to people who are better customers, i.e. who are richer customers who can borrow more money, to avoid the neediest people in the world, because they're obviously their loans, management of their loans is most expensive and they take smaller loans, and in some cases completely not even try to enter markets. Okay, that's why we have food deserts in the United States, because grocery stores don't see it profitable to sell, to sell vegetables in, I don't know, Dorchester. I'm just using that as an example. I don't know if that's true, but I'm saying you pick examples. So I think there's a different kind of business can be practiced in a different way. That's the emergence of what's called social enterprise, where you use business techniques, you understand markets, you look for revenues, you have exit opportunities for investors, but the governance structure of these businesses is to maximize impact, and to do everything to maximize impact within those constraints. And I think to the degree that microfinance can incorporate, can take from the ethos of social enterprise as its guiding force, rather than the ethos of profit maximizing enterprises, it could avert what could otherwise be a big crisis of, there have been branches that have been burnt down in other parts of the world too, microfinance branches and so forth. So I think that it's potentially a big problem, and I hope it doesn't become one. Thank you. Could we end with a different question?
Well,
it feels kind of a little negative, so I just want to...
Well, what I did want, we do have to end, but I did want to ask each of you very quickly. We often associate idealism with youth, but if you could just very quickly tell us, how has idealism emerged, changed in your lives? What has been, how has it grown? Or has it grown? Has it diminished? I mean, so often we think that idealism is just the province of the young. Tell us about how the idealistic spirit what has been its journey in your life, in one sentence or less.
Well, I'll start. The dictionary definition of idealism is forming ideals and living under their influence. And yes, it's associated with youth. And what I've often said to people is, if you stay idealistic, you'll stay young. Bobby Kennedy said, youth is a state of mind, it's not a time of life. And so I've actually become more idealistic over my life, because I've actually seen things happen that most people said weren't going to happen when we first started working on them, because of the collective effort of people. And so, I've had too many experiences where, breakthrough things have happened. So I become more idealistic, but, people who are younger tend to be, more open to it. But I'll tell you, one of the most idealistic people I know is 83 years old. His name is Harris Wofford. And he was involved in, he fought in World War II, he marched with Dr. King, he helped to start the Peace Corps, he helped to get Jack Kennedy elected, he became senator, he helped to make AmeriCorps happen, he was a college president. He's 83, and he is still, going strong on, using every minute he's got to try to make a difference. So I think it is a state of mind, and it's if you have ideals that you care about and you try to live under their influence, you can stay idealistic. And it also makes you happier, I think.
Mm-hmm. What has been the trajectory of idealism in your life, Pamela?
Well, I think one of the things I would start with is more of a quote from Vince Lombardi, one of the great coaches, because he says, we will relentlessly chase after and pursue excellence, not perfection, because it's not, or he says, well, we'll chase after perfection, but we'll kind of achieve excellence. And I think if we, the idealistic, if we have this super defined, constraining model of what it is that you've got to achieve, that's in a box, that's, too perfect in a way, we're all evolving. I mean, don't they say something like the cells change in your body and you're a new person every 7 days? I think that also in my mind as well. For me, it's evolved. I'll give a quick example. Universal Giving, we were redoing our mission and our values. And I immediately stopped the process with my team because I realized I hadn't done it for myself. I hadn't revisited my mission and values. They were kind of tucked away. And I thought, wait, I need to take my PSR, my personal social responsibility first. And as I went through my values, they changed radically from when I was younger, which was enthusiasm and joy, and which is nothing wrong with that. But as now my values include things such as presence, being present with people. One of my values is listening. One of my values is purity, because one of the things I try to do, not just at night, but throughout the day, is empty my mind of anything that might build up, that might be a resentment, that might be something negative. That's how I renew. And so I guess I don't really think as much about the term idealism, but I do think about renewal often, and about clearing out my mind of anything that wouldn't help me be progressive, positive, idealistic in my life. And so I do think about purity. Now that doesn't sound like idealism, but I'm going to go with that. So,
Yeah, David, how is it advanced and transformed in your experience?
Yeah, it's really, what a good question. The phrase, from Kennedy's inaugural speech, where there's a generation that's been tempered by the Cold War, and having had that experience, is in a position perhaps to do something, to think anew. When I interview people who are causing social change today, I see them as sort of tempered idealists, which is to say they are aware of the limit. Too often idealism, when it's kind of divorced from reality or pragmatism, can very quickly fall into cynicism when those ideals are not met. You protested, and nothing happened. Let's say, for example, it's very easy. And I think what I see today, especially among a lot of young people, but I also see it particularly among the encore career generation, people in their 55 to 85 or 95 years who are sort of reinventing their careers, realizing that, they have another 30 years to live and that you just can't play that much golf, So, this idea that sort of recovering it. But I think what I see is people whose experience has been tempered by having seen the war on poverty, and having seen the war on drugs, and the war on cancer, and the war on terror, and all of these things, and having a much more sort of healthy and pragmatic appraisal of what's possible, and still persisting in trying to solve problems, even though there's a lot of evidence out there saying it's very difficult to solve problems, and yet still going on, and also realizing deep in their heart that change is not merely saying that you don't like what you see. It's not merely an act of protest. It's inherently a constructive act. We must build things if we want the world to change. We must actually think creatively and construct things. And also, so idealism wedded to that constructive impulse is the biggest change that I'm seeing. And also, the last point, which is this quote that has always struck me from Saint Francois de Saint-Exupéry, the author of The Little Prince, which is that a single event can awaken within us a stranger totally unknown to us. To live is to be slowly born. And so to be open to the idea that, and like the quote over there, that we don't know yet who we are because we don't know yet what we will do in the future.
Well, that's a wonderful way, I think, for us to end. And I look forward to sharing a future of social change and new visions in social change with everyone in this room and everyone in our global community. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again.